What was the worst thing someone told you after you recovered from a coma? I woke up in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and fear, and the first thing I heard was my fiancé's mother saying in a hushed voice, "We should plan the wedding without waiting for her to be herself again. She might never be the same mentally, and Michael deserves to move forward with his life." I couldn't move anything except my eyes, couldn't speak or signal that I was conscious and understanding every single word. My name is Dr. Sofia Castellano, and before the accident that put me in a coma for 8 weeks, I had a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from MIT and held the North American record for memory competitions. I could memorize a shuffled deck of cards in under 30 seconds and recall lists of 500 random digits after hearing them once. My research focused on consciousness and brain plasticity, and the irony of ending up in a coma wasn't lost on me once I finally processed what had happened. The accident itself was stupid and preventable. A drunk driver ran a red light while I was crossing the street near my lab, and I'd been thrown 15 feet into a concrete barrier. The impact caused severe traumatic brain injury with bleeding and swelling that required 2 emergency surgeries. I'd been in a medically induced coma for the first 3 weeks while my brain healed, and then remained in what doctors called a minimally conscious state for another 5 weeks. During that time, I could hear everything happening around me, but my body wouldn't respond to commands and I couldn't communicate in any way that registered on their tests. The neurologist told my family I might never wake up fully, and if I did, there was a high probability of permanent cognitive impairment. Michael's family had taken that information and apparently decided to start making plans that assumed I'd be a vegetable forever. I could hear them visiting my room every few days, discussing wedding venues and guest lists and whether they should just go ahead without me being mentally present. What they didn't know was that my brain was recording every conversation with perfect clarity. One of the strange effects of my particular type of injury was that while I couldn't move or speak, my memory formation was not only intact but somehow enhanced. Every word spoken near my bed got stored in my mind with timestamp precision, every detail of who said what and when. Michael's mother, Patricia, was the worst. She'd sit next to my bed and talk to Michael about how this was probably for the best in the long run, that I'd been too focused on my career anyway, and maybe this was God's way of making me a better wife. She suggested they could move the wedding up to next month instead of waiting until fall, and that way Michael wouldn't have to deal with the uncertainty of my recovery timeline. Michael himself was quieter during these conversations, occasionally protesting weakly that they should wait and see, but never actually shutting down his mother's planning. That hurt worse than any physical pain from my injuries. The medical team had no idea I was conscious during those weeks because all their standard tests showed minimal brain activity. They'd shine lights in my eyes and pinch my arms and call my name, and I'd desperately try to respond, but nothing would happen. My body was completely disconnected from my intentions, trapped in this prison while my mind screamed to be heard. The neurologist, Dr. Raymond Kwan, was the only one who seemed uncertain about my prognosis. He'd run additional tests that weren't standard protocol, checking for subtle signs of awareness that the other doctors dismissed as reflexive responses. During one of his examinations, he spoke directly to me even though everyone else thought I couldn't hear. He said that if I could understand him, I should know that some coma patients retain full consciousness and that he was watching for any signs I might be one of them. That small acknowledgement that I might be in here made me feel less completely alone. 6 weeks into the coma, Patricia brought a wedding planner to my hospital room. They stood at the foot of my bed discussing flower arrangements and seating charts while I lay there unable to scream at them to get out. The planner asked uncomfortable questions about whether I'd be attending the wedding or if they should plan around my absence, and Patricia said confidently that even if I woke up, I probably wouldn't be capable of participating in any meaningful way. She told the planner that Michael and I had been engaged for 2 years, and she wasn't going to let her son's life get put on hold indefinitely because of my accident. The planner looked uncomfortable but took notes anyway, and they spent 45 minutes planning a wedding that was supposedly mine but that I had zero input on. I memorized every single detail they discussed, every vendor name and price point and decision, storing it all away with perfect clarity while they assumed I was essentially brain dead. The breakthrough came during week 7 when Dr. Kwan tried a new assessment technique he'd read about in recent research. He asked me yes or no questions and told me to try imagining playing tennis for yes and imagining walking through my house for no. Those specific mental images create distinct patterns in brain activity that can be detected on functional MRI scans even when a patient can't physically respond. I focused with everything I had on imagining tennis when he asked if I could hear him, visualizing every detail of swinging a racket and running across a court. The fMRI lit up exactly the way it should for a conscious patient, and Dr. Kwan's face transformed from clinical interest to barely contained excitement. He ran the test 3 more times with different questions, and each time I produced the correct response pattern. He told my family immediately that I was conscious and aware, that I'd been hearing everything this entire time, and they needed to be very careful about what they said around me. Michael's reaction to this news was strange. He looked relieved for about 5 seconds, and then this expression of absolute panic crossed his face as he presumably realized I'd heard every conversation about planning the wedding without me. Patricia went pale and actually clutched the wall for support, and I watched her mouth open and close several times without any sound coming out. Dr. Kwan explained that patients in my state often had intact memory formation, and that I'd likely remember everything that happened during the coma once I fully recovered. He recommended they start talking to me directly and treating me as fully conscious even though I couldn't respond yet, and that physical therapy should begin immediately to work on reconnecting my brain to my motor functions. After Dr. Kwan left the room, Patricia and Michael stood there in awful silence for probably 2 minutes before Patricia whispered that they needed to talk privately and basically fled. The physical recovery process was brutal and humiliating in ways I hadn't anticipated. My muscles had atrophied severely during 8 weeks of immobility, and simple tasks like lifting my arm or turning my head required enormous effort. A physical therapist named Jerome worked with me twice daily, moving my limbs through ranges of motion and encouraging me to try activating muscles that felt completely foreign. Speech therapy was even worse because I could form thoughts perfectly, but my mouth wouldn't cooperate with making sounds. I'd try to say simple words and only manage garbled noises that didn't resemble language at all. The speech therapist, Angela, was endlessly patient and reminded me that my brain needed to rebuild all these neural pathways that had been damaged. She said most patients in my situation took months to regain clear speech, and I shouldn't get discouraged by the slow progress. But I was discouraged because I had a PhD and had won international memory competitions, and now I couldn't even say my own name clearly. Michael visited every day during those first 2 weeks of active recovery, but something had fundamentally changed between us. He'd sit in the chair next to my bed making awkward small talk about weather and hospital food, carefully avoiding any mention of wedding plans or his mother's previous visits. I still couldn't speak well enough to confront him about what I'd heard, could only make these frustrated grunting sounds when I tried to form sentences. During one visit, Michael actually started crying and said he was sorry for not standing up to his mother better, that he'd been overwhelmed and scared and hadn't known what to do. He said he loved me and wanted to support my recovery however long it took, but his voice had this hollow quality that made me not believe him. I wished desperately that I could speak clearly enough to tell him exactly what I thought of him and his mother's plan to just move forward without me. My first clear word came 3 weeks after the breakthrough fMRI test. Angela had been working with me on the word no, because it was phonetically simple and emotionally important for patient autonomy. I practiced for hours, trying to coordinate my tongue and lips and breath to produce that one syllable. When Michael visited that evening and asked if I wanted him to stay longer, something inside me finally connected, and I managed to say no, with perfect clarity. His face went through this complicated series of expressions, ending on hurt confusion, and he asked if I was sure. I said no again, even clearer this time, and he nodded slowly before gathering his things to leave. After he left, I actually smiled for the first time since waking up, because I'd successfully communicated my actual wishes, instead of being a passive observer to everyone else's decisions about my life. Dr. Kwan increased the intensity of my cognitive assessments once I started regaining speech. He'd give me memory tests that would have been challenging even before the accident, like memorizing random number sequences or recalling details from stories he read aloud. To everyone's shock except mine, I performed at nearly the same level I had before the coma. The random digit span that I could recall was still over 200 numbers after a single hearing, and I could memorize a shuffled deck of cards in under 45 seconds when he gave me playing cards to practice with. Dr. Kwan documented everything carefully and told me this was extraordinary, that most traumatic brain injury patients showed significant cognitive deficits even years after recovery. He theorized that my pre-existing neural architecture from years of memory training had somehow protected my cognitive functions or helped my brain compensate for the damage. Whatever the reason, it was becoming increasingly clear that I wasn't going to be the mentally impaired person Patricia had planned around. 4 weeks into active recovery, I could walk short distances with assistance and speak in full sentences, though I still had this slurred quality to my words that frustrated me constantly. Michael's visits had become less frequent, down to maybe every other day, and Patricia had stopped coming entirely after that first revelation that I'd been conscious during the coma. One afternoon, Michael showed up with his mother, and Patricia had this forced smile plastered across her face as she said she was so happy to see me recovering so well. I looked directly at her and said slowly but clearly, "I heard everything you said about planning the wedding without me." Patricia's smile froze, and Michael looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. She tried to stammer something about being worried and not knowing what else to do, but I cut her off and said, "You called me God's way of making me a better wife. You said Michael deserved to move forward with his life like I was already dead." The room went completely silent except for the beeping of monitors and distant hospital sounds from the hallway. Patricia's face had gone from fake happy to genuinely pale, and she started crying these awful theatrical tears while saying she'd just been so scared and hadn't meant any of it. Michael tried to defend her by saying everyone was under enormous stress and people say things they don't mean during crisis situations. I looked at him and said with as much clarity as I could manage, "You sat there and let her plan our wedding while I was in a coma. You never once told her to stop." Michael didn't have a response to that, just stood there looking guilty and miserable, and after maybe a minute of horrible silence, they both left. Angela, who'd been standing quietly near the door during this confrontation, came over and squeezed my hand and said I'd done a brave thing by speaking my truth. I felt exhausted and angry and relieved all at once. The engagement ended officially 2 days later when Michael came by alone and said he thought maybe we should take some time apart while I focused on recovery. His voice had this practiced quality like he'd rehearsed this speech, and he used phrases like different people now and unfair to both of us that sounded like they came from his mother's playbook. I told him I agreed we should end things, and the relief on his face was honestly insulting. He left the engagement ring on my bedside table and walked out, and I never saw him again. Lying there alone afterward, I felt this complicated mix of grief and anger, and something that might have been freedom. The relationship I'd thought was solid had evaporated the moment I became inconvenient, and finding that out while literally unable to defend myself had been its own special kind of trauma. But at least now I knew the truth about who Michael really was when things got difficult. Dr. Kwan stopped by later that day and found me crying while staring at the ring on the table. He didn't ask what happened, just pulled up a chair and sat quietly until I was ready to talk. When I finally explained about the breakup, he said something I wasn't expecting. He told me that traumatic brain injury often revealed people's true characters, both the patients and everyone around them, and that sometimes the revelations were painful, but ultimately valuable. He said I was showing remarkable strength in my recovery, both physical and now emotional, and he had no doubt I'd eventually get back to my research career. Then he asked if I'd be interested in participating in a study about consciousness during coma states, since my case was so unusual with the intact memory formation. The idea of turning my awful experience into data that might help other patients made me feel slightly less like this had all been completely pointless. Physical therapy progressed faster once I had the motivation of spite driving me forward. I wanted to recover fully and completely, wanted to return to my lab and my research and prove to everyone who'd written me off that I was still exactly who I'd been before. Jerome pushed me harder once he saw how determined I was, adding more challenging exercises and longer walking sessions. 6 weeks post-coma, I could walk independently for short distances and my speech was nearly normal with just occasional slurring when I was tired. My fine motor control was still impaired, meaning I had trouble with precise hand movements like writing or typing, but occupational therapy was helping rebuild those neural pathways. The progress was measurable and real, and every small victory felt like evidence that Patricia had been completely wrong about me never being the same. The hospital social worker, Linda Cho, helped me navigate the practical disasters of being in a coma for 2 months. My apartment lease had been terminated by my landlord after Michael failed to pay rent from my accounts, and all my belongings were in storage that I'd now have to pay back fees for. My car insurance had lapsed, and I had thousands of dollars in medical bills even with insurance covering most of it. My position at the Research Institute was technically still held for me under FMLA, but I'd missed 2 major grant deadlines and my graduate students had been reassigned to other faculty. Linda helped me apply for temporary disability benefits and worked with the billing department to set up a manageable payment plan for my hospital costs. The administrative nightmare of rebuilding my life from a hospital bed was almost as exhausting as the physical therapy. My colleagues from the lab started visiting once word spread that I was actually recovering. My research partner, Dr. James Okafor, came by with printed copies of our latest paper submissions and updates on our ongoing studies. He told me the department had been devastated when I was first injured, that everyone assumed my career was over, and the chair had actually started advertising my position as available. James had fought to keep my spot open, arguing that it was too early to make permanent decisions, and now he was vindicated. He looked at me with this mixture of amazement and scientific curiosity, and said I was living proof of everything our research had theorized about brain plasticity and consciousness. He asked detailed questions about my subjective experience during the coma, taking notes like he was conducting an informal interview, and I realized my trauma was actually a valuable data point for our field. That realization was both disturbing and oddly comforting. 3 months post-accident, I was discharged from inpatient care to a rehabilitation facility where I'd continue intensive therapy while living in a semi-independent setting. The facility had small private rooms and communal spaces for meals and activities, and most residents were elderly stroke patients or younger people recovering from accidents like mine. My roommate across the hall was a guy named Marcus who'd been in a motorcycle crash and was relearning to walk after spinal damage. We bonded over our shared frustration with bodies that wouldn't cooperate with our intentions, and he made dark jokes about our situation that helped make it feel less completely hopeless. The facility's schedule was rigid with therapy sessions filling most of the day, but I appreciated the structure because it gave me clear goals to work toward instead of just existing in uncertainty. During a cognitive assessment at the rehab facility, the neuropsychologist, Dr. Ellen Park, ran me through the same battery of tests I'd taken before the accident when I was competing in memory championships. She was thorough and professional, testing everything from working memory to processing speed to executive function. When she scored the results, her expression shifted from clinical neutrality to genuine surprise. My scores were not just good for a traumatic brain injury patient, they were good, period. Several subtests showed performance at or above my pre-accident baseline, and Dr. Park said she'd never seen cognitive recovery like this in her 15 years of practice. She documented everything carefully and said she wanted to present my case at the next neuropsychology conference because it challenged assumptions about TBI recovery. I felt this surge of vindication knowing that objective testing proved I was still mentally intact, despite what Patricia had assumed. The memory of Patricia planning my wedding while I was in a coma kept replaying in my mind during quiet moments, and I found myself getting angrier instead of moving past it. My therapist at the facility, Dr. Raymond Kowalski, helped me work through the rage without letting it consume me. He explained that what I'd experienced was a form of medical trauma layered on top of physical trauma, and that feeling violated made complete sense given how vulnerable I'd been. He asked what outcome I actually wanted from this situation, whether I needed some form of justice or just validation that what happened was wrong. I thought about it for several sessions before admitting I wanted Patricia and Michael to face consequences for discussing me like I was already gone, for making plans about my life without my knowledge or consent. Dr. Kowalski asked if I'd considered documenting what happened, not necessarily for legal action but for my own sense of agency over my story. That conversation planted an idea that grew over the following week. I started writing down everything I remembered from the coma period with the same precision I'd used for memory competitions. Every conversation, every date, every detail of the wedding planning discussion. My recall was perfect because that's what my brain does, store information with timestamp accuracy, and within 3 days I had a 20-page document detailing exactly what had been said around my bedside. Dr. Kowalski read it and said this was powerful testimony about consciousness during coma states, and that it might have value beyond just personal catharsis. He suggested I might want to speak with a lawyer, not necessarily to sue anyone but to understand what legal protections existed for patients in vulnerable states. The idea felt simultaneously vindictive and completely justified. and I sat with those conflicting feelings for several days before making any decisions. I reached out to a disability rights attorney named Marcus Finley, who'd been recommended by Linda Cho, the hospital social worker. His office was downtown in a building with elevator access, and I took a mobility van from the rehab facility for the consultation. Marcus listened to my story without interrupting, taking occasional notes, and when I finished, he sat back and said this was one of the most clear-cut cases of dignity violation he'd encountered. He explained that while Patricia and Michael hadn't technically done anything illegal, their behavior raised serious questions about medical ethics and patient rights. The fact that I'd been conscious and hearing everything created a unique situation because usually, coma patients have no awareness of what's discussed around them. Marcus said my detailed documentation was valuable evidence, and he could draft a letter to Patricia and Michael making clear that their behavior was documented and inappropriate, even if it wasn't criminal. The letter Marcus drafted was professional, but pointed, laying out the timeline of my consciousness during the coma, and specifically citing conversations about wedding planning that occurred while I was unable to consent or participate. He noted that discussing a patient's future life decisions while they're in a vulnerable medical state raises ethical concerns about respect for autonomy and dignity. The letter didn't threaten any legal action, but made clear that I had complete documentation of everything said in my presence, and that I was prepared to share this information with medical ethics boards if they ever attempted to portray my recovery as anything other than complete. Marcus sent copies to both Patricia and Michael via certified mail, and we waited to see how they'd respond. I felt nervous and empowered at the same time, finally taking some active role in addressing what had happened instead of just being a passive victim. Patricia's response came within a week through her own attorney, a defensive letter claiming everything said during my coma had been motivated by concern and stress. Her lawyer argued that family members of coma patients often discuss difficult possibilities as a coping mechanism, and that Patricia's words had been taken out of context. The letter insisted Patricia had always hoped for my complete recovery and never intended to plan the wedding without me, just wanted to keep options open during an uncertain time. Reading this revisionist version of events made my blood pressure spike because I had perfect recall of exactly what was said and the tone it was said in. Patricia had not been stressed and uncertain. She'd been confident and dismissive, treating me like a problem to be worked around rather than a person who might recover. Michael's response was more personal, and even worse. He called the rehab facility directly and asked to speak with me, and against my better judgment, I took the call in the common room where other residents were watching TV. Michael's voice had this pleading quality as he said he understood I was angry, but couldn't I see how hard this had been for everyone? He said his mother had just been trying to help him cope with an impossible situation and that she'd never actually gone through with planning the wedding. He claimed the wedding planner visit had just been his mom looking into options and that no decisions had been made. I listened to him revise history in real time and felt my jaw clenching harder with each sentence. When he finally paused, I told him I had perfect recall of every word spoken during my coma and that his mother had absolutely made decisions, including setting a date for next month. Michael went quiet and then had the audacity to say I shouldn't let my memory competition skills make me hold grudges. I hung up on him. The incident motivated me to work even harder in therapy, driven by this need to prove I was completely recovered and functional. My physical therapist noticed the change in intensity and asked if something had happened, and I explained about Michael's phone call. She nodded and said spite was actually an excellent motivator for rehabilitation, as long as it didn't lead to overtraining and injury. We designed a more aggressive therapy schedule that pushed my limits without crossing into dangerous territory, and I threw myself into every session with ferocious focus. 4 months post-coma, I could walk normally without any assistive devices. My speech was completely clear, and my fine motor skills had recovered enough that I could write and type again. Dr. Park ran another round of cognitive testing, and my scores had actually improved slightly from the previous assessment. I was not just recovered. I was measurably better than I'd been before, possibly because the injury had forced my brain to form new, more efficient neural pathways. My return to work happened gradually, starting with part-time remote consulting from the rehab facility, before transitioning to in-person hours at the lab. My department chair, Dr. Alice Brennan, welcomed me back with genuine warmth and apologized for the earlier discussions about replacing me. She said she'd been advised by university council that they needed to plan for worst-case scenarios, but she'd always hoped I'd prove the pessimistic predictions wrong. Alice asked about my research interests going forward, and I told her I wanted to refocus my work specifically on consciousness during coma states. My personal experience had revealed gaps in current assessment methods, and I had ideas for new protocols that might identify conscious patients earlier than standard tests allowed. Alice approved a grant application I'd been drafting in my head during therapy sessions, and within 2 months I had funding to start preliminary research. Turning my trauma into productive science felt like the best possible revenge against everyone who'd assumed I'd never work again. The memory competition circuit reached out about 6 months post-accident after word spread about my recovery and maintained abilities. The competition organizer, Rita Chen, called to say there was a regional championship coming up and asked if I'd be interested in competing or even just attending as a guest. I hesitated because the idea of performing publicly felt terrifying after months of being seen as damaged and impaired, but Rita said my story would be inspiring to the community and that no one expected me to perform at my previous level. That last comment bothered me more than she probably intended because I didn't want accommodations or lowered expectations. I told Rita I'd compete if she'd let me enter as a regular participant without any special consideration, and she agreed immediately. I had 3 weeks to prepare, which wasn't much time, but I'd been practicing memory techniques during therapy sessions to keep my skills sharp. The competition took place in a hotel conference room with maybe 50 participants and about the same number of spectators, mostly family members and memory enthusiasts. When I walked in, several people recognized me and looked shocked to see me there. Word had spread about my accident in Coma, and apparently most people had assumed my competitive career was over. I registered under my full name, Dr. Sofia Castellano, and they listed my previous records next to my entry. The first event was random digit memorization, where competitors get 5 minutes to memorize as many digits as possible from a randomized list. I sat at my assigned desk with the paper face down and my pencil ready, and when the timer started, I flipped it over and began encoding the digits using my usual Palace method. The numbers flowed into my memory architecture exactly the way they always had, and when recall time came, I wrote out 387 digits without any gaps or uncertainties. The judges verified my recall and announced my score, and the room went silent for a moment before people started clapping. My score was the highest in the room and actually beat my previous personal record by 14 digits. Rita came over with this expression of amazement and asked how I'd managed to improve after everything I'd been through, and I explained that the brain injury had forced me to rebuild my memory systems from scratch, possibly creating more efficient pathways in the process. The rest of the competition went similarly well, with me placing first in card memorization and second in names and faces association. When they announced final rankings, I'd won the overall competition with a combined score that qualified me for nationals. Standing on that small podium accepting a trophy felt more meaningful than any of my previous wins, because I'd earned this one while climbing out of a hole that was supposed to be impossible to escape. Michael found out about my competition win through mutual friends, and sent a long email that I almost deleted without reading. In the message, he congratulated me on my recovery and said he was glad I was doing so well. He also said he'd gotten engaged to someone new, someone he'd met through his mother's church group, and he hoped I'd understand that he'd needed to move forward with his life. The email had this defensive tone like he was justifying his choices to me, and I realized he felt guilty about how everything had ended. I drafted 3 different responses ranging from coldly polite to brutally honest before deciding not to respond at all. Michael's life and choices were no longer my concern, and engaging with him would just give him the absolution he was seeking. I deleted the email and went back to work on my grant proposal about consciousness assessment. The research study I was conducting started recruiting participants about 7 months after my accident. We focused on TBI patients who'd been in minimally conscious states and were now recovered, interviewing them about their subjective experiences during the coma period. The data was revealing patterns that challenged medical assumptions about awareness and memory formation. Many patients reported hearing and understanding conversations around their beds, but being unable to signal consciousness to medical staff. Some had perfect recall of specific events, while others had fragmented memories that came back gradually. We were developing new assessment protocols based on these findings, using brain imaging techniques to detect consciousness in patients who couldn't physically respond. Dr. Kwan partnered with me on the research, bringing his neurological expertise while I contributed the cognitive science framework and personal insight. The work felt urgent and meaningful in ways my previous research hadn't. Patricia tried to reach out 9 months post-accident through a mutual friend who called saying Patricia wanted to apologize in person. I declined the meeting but wrote Patricia a letter explaining exactly how her behavior during my coma had affected me. I detailed specific conversations I'd heard, describing my experience of lying there paralyzed while she planned my wedding and discussed me like I was already gone. I explained that hearing someone you trust discussing your diminished future while you're trapped in your own body creates a specific kind of trauma that doesn't just disappear when you recover. The letter wasn't written to make her feel better or offer forgiveness. It was written to make sure she understood exactly what she'd done and why it was wrong. I never received a response, and I didn't expect one. The point was documenting my perspective for my own record, not having a dialogue with someone who'd already proven they didn't respect my autonomy. My 1-year post-accident checkup with Dr. Kwan showed complete recovery on all clinical measures. Brain scans revealed some residual scarring from the original injury, but no functional impairment. My cognitive testing scores were in the superior range across all domains, and my physical coordination was back to baseline. Dr. Kwan said he'd never seen a recovery this complete from an injury as severe as mine had been, and he asked permission to include my case in his research publications. I agreed with the condition that my story include details about remaining conscious during the coma and what I'd overheard, because that aspect of the experience needed more attention in medical literature. He nodded seriously and said he'd emphasize the importance of treating all coma patients as potentially conscious, regardless of their apparent responsiveness on standard tests. The National Memory Championship took place a year and 2 months after my accident in a convention center in Chicago, with competitors from across North America. I'd qualified based on my regional win, and the competition was significantly more intense than anything I'd done before. The field included professional memory athletes who trained full-time and regularly set world records. I felt nervous in ways I hadn't at previous competitions because now I had something to prove beyond just winning. I needed to demonstrate that recovery from trauma didn't mean settling for diminished abilities. The multi-day event tested every aspect of memory skills, from card memorization to abstract images to binary digits. I competed in all categories and pushed myself harder than I had in years, determined to perform at the absolute peak of my abilities. The final results placed me 3rd overall in the national championship, behind 2 competitors who'd been dominating the circuit for years. Standing on that podium with a bronze medal around my neck while cameras flashed and people applauded felt surreal. The winner, a competitor named David Flynn, came over afterward and said he'd followed my story and found it incredibly motivating that I was competing at this level after everything I'd been through. His sincerity was unexpected and moved me more than I wanted to admit. During the awards dinner that evening, several competitors asked me about my experience and recovery, and I found myself telling the story of the coma and what I'd overheard about the wedding planning. Their reactions ranged from shock to anger on my behalf, and one competitor actually asked if I'd sued my ex-fiancé's family. I explained that what they'd done wasn't illegal, just cruel, and that my revenge had been proving them completely wrong about my recovery potential. Rita Chen approached me at the dinner and asked if I'd be interested in giving a keynote speech at next year's regional championship about memory, trauma, and recovery. She said my story had already become well known in the community and that people found it inspiring to see someone overcome such a severe setback. I agreed tentatively, feeling both honored and uncomfortable with being held up as inspiration. The reality of my recovery had been messy and painful, and driven partly by spite, and I worried about sanitizing that experience into some neat narrative about overcoming adversity. Rita assured me they wanted my honest perspective, not a motivational poster version, and that authenticity would resonate more than false positivity. I started drafting the speech in my head on the flight home, thinking about how to articulate the weird intersection of medical trauma, personal betrayal, and cognitive resilience. My research paper about consciousness during coma states was accepted to the Journal of Neuroscience, with minor revisions about 18 months post-accident. The paper included my own case as one of several examples of patients who maintained awareness while appearing minimally conscious on standard tests. We argued for new protocols that assumed consciousness unless proven otherwise, rather than the current approach that assumed unconsciousness unless the patient could demonstrate awareness through limited physical responses. The paper proposed specific brain imaging techniques that could detect consciousness in patients who couldn't move, potentially identifying aware patients weeks or months earlier than current methods allowed. Several major media outlets picked up the story because of my personal connection to the research, and I did interviews explaining how my experience as both patient and scientist had shaped the work. Michael's mother, Patricia, reached out directly about 2 years post-accident through a handwritten letter sent to my university office. The letter was 3 pages of apologetic explanation about her behavior during my coma, claiming she'd been operating from a place of fear and misguided love for her son. She wrote that seeing me not just recover, but excel professionally and personally, had made her realize how wrong she'd been about my prognosis and about my value as a person. Patricia said she'd sought therapy to address her controlling behavior, and had come to understand how her actions during my vulnerable state had been a violation of my dignity. The letter asked for forgiveness but acknowledged she had no right to expect it, and ended with a statement that she was proud of everything I'd accomplished. Reading it made me feel complicated things I hadn't expected, including some small softening toward this woman who'd discussed me like I was already a burden to be managed. I didn't respond to the letter, but I kept it filed away in my desk drawer as documentation that my truth had been acknowledged. The keynote speech at the Regional Memory Championship happened 2 years and 3 months after the accident, in front of about 200 people in a hotel ballroom. I'd prepared extensively, writing and rewriting until the talk balanced personal narrative with scientific insight. I started by describing my accident and coma in clinical terms, then shifted to the subjective experience of consciousness without the ability to communicate. I explained about lying paralyzed while hearing my future discussed like I was already gone, and I didn't soften the details about wedding planning or Patricia's comments about me becoming a better wife. Several people in the audience gasped audibly, and I saw others wiping their eyes. Then I transitioned to discussing recovery and how spite and determination had motivated me to prove everyone wrong. I showed my competition results and research accomplishments, demonstrating measurable success despite starting from a place of complete physical helplessness. The speech ended with a discussion of what my experience taught me about human resilience and the danger of assumptions about damaged people. I emphasized that my recovery wasn't miraculous or exceptional. It was the result of my brain's existing architecture combined with intensive therapy and access to resources that many patients don't have. I talked about the patients in my research study who'd recovered consciousness but lacked the support systems or cognitive reserve to rebuild their lives as completely as I had. The final message was that we need to treat all vulnerable people with dignity and assume their capacity for recovery rather than writing them off at their lowest point. The applause when I finished was sustained and emotional, and several people approached me afterward saying the speech had changed how they thought about trauma and capability. Rita hugged me and said that was exactly the kind of authentic storytelling the community needed. My 3-year post-accident evaluation showed continued stability in all measures, with no signs of cognitive decline or delayed effects from the original injury. Dr. Kwan said I was essentially a neurological success story, and that I'd become a case study in multiple research contexts, from consciousness studies to brain plasticity to recovery trajectories. He'd published 4 papers that referenced my case, always with my permission and often with my direct collaboration. The relationship had evolved from doctor-patient to research colleagues, and we were planning a joint study about assessment techniques for minimally conscious patients. The work felt like turning my worst experience into something that might prevent other patients from being dismissed as unaware when they're actually conscious and listening to every word. I ran into Michael completely by chance at a coffee shop near campus about 3.5 years after the accident. He was there with his wife and a baby in a stroller, looking domestic and settled in ways that seemed impossibly distant from the person I'd been engaged to. Our eyes met across the shop, and there was this moment of mutual recognition and discomfort. Michael approached me hesitantly and introduced his wife Lauren, who'd clearly been briefed about me because she had this sympathetic expression like I was someone to be pitied. Michael asked how I was doing, and I gave him a brief update about my research and competition results, watching his face shift from polite interest to something like regret as he realized how well I'd done without him. His wife looked between us with growing awareness that something complicated existed in this history, and after a few awkward minutes, they made excuses about needing to leave. Watching them walk away with their stroller, I felt nothing except mild curiosity about what my life would have looked like if Michael had been stronger during my crisis. Probably I'd have spent these years building someone else's dreams instead of rebuilding my own, making compromises to fit into his family's expectations. The accident and coma had been traumatic, but they'd also functioned as this brutal filter that removed people from my life who only cared about me when I was convenient. The Patricia incident had shown me exactly what kind of family I'd almost married into, and that knowledge had been painful but valuable. I didn't wish them ill, but I also didn't wish I was still part of their lives. I was genuinely better off having discovered these truths about their character, even though the discovery process had been horrific. 4 years post-accident, I was promoted to associate professor with early tenure based on the strength of my research output and teaching evaluations. My lab had expanded to include 3 graduate students and 2 postdocs, all working on various aspects of consciousness and recovery from brain injury. We'd secured a major grant from the National Institutes of Health to develop new assessment protocols for coma patients, with plans to test them in hospitals across the country. The work was getting attention beyond academic circles, with hospitals actually implementing our recommendations about treating all patients as potentially conscious. Several families had contacted me saying that new protocols helped identify awareness in their loved ones months earlier than would have happened with standard testing. Those messages made the entire nightmare of my accident feel like it had served some larger purpose beyond just my personal suffering. The memory competition circuit inducted me into their Hall of Fame 5 years post-accident, recognizing both my competitive achievements and my contributions to the broader community through advocacy and research. The ceremony included a video montage of my career highlights, including footage from competitions before the accident and my return performance at nationals. Watching younger me compete without any awareness of what was coming felt strange and sad, like looking at a different person who existed in simpler times. But then the montage showed my bronze medal performance at nationals and recent competition wins, demonstrating that post-accident me had matched or exceeded pre-accident performance levels. The crowd gave me a standing ovation, and I accepted the award feeling complicated gratitude for a journey I would never have chosen, but couldn't regret surviving. Dr. Kowalski, my therapist from the rehab facility, checked in periodically over the years to see how I was processing everything long-term. During our 5-year follow-up session, he asked whether I'd fully processed the anger toward Patricia and Michael, or if it still surfaced unexpectedly. I thought about it honestly and said the acute rage had faded into something more like resigned disappointment with occasional flares of irritation. I'd stopped replaying their bedside conversations obsessively, stopped imagining detailed confrontations where I perfectly articulated their failures. The memory was still there with perfect clarity because that's how my brain works, but it had become more like historical data than active trauma. Kowalski nodded and said that was healthy progression, that I'd successfully integrated the experience without letting it define my entire identity. He asked if I ever regretted not pursuing more aggressive action against them, and I said sometimes, but mostly I felt satisfied that I'd proven them wrong through excellence rather than litigation. 6 years post-accident, I delivered a TEDx talk about consciousness, dignity, and assumptions about damaged people. The talk reached millions of viewers online and generated discussions about medical ethics and patient rights. Several advocacy groups contacted me about collaborating on policy recommendations for hospital protocols around coma patients. Medical schools started using my case in their curricula to teach students about the importance of treating all patients as conscious and deserving of dignity, regardless of their apparent responsiveness. The attention was sometimes overwhelming, but it felt like positive impact emerging from negative experience. Patricia's plan to marry off her son to a supposedly diminished version of me had inadvertently launched my career in advocacy and raised awareness about issues that rarely get public attention. My most recent memory competition performance, 7 years post-accident, resulted in a gold medal at nationals and a new North American record in random digit recall. Standing on that top step of the podium with cameras recording and people cheering felt like the final proof that recovery doesn't mean settling for less than you were. It means rebuilding better and stronger because you've learned things about yourself and the world that you couldn't have learned any other way. The medal hangs in my office now next to my research awards and my PhD diploma, physical evidence of a life reconstructed against everyone's expectations. Students who visit for office hours sometimes ask about my story, and I tell them the truth. That trauma reveals who people really are, both your supporters and your doubters, and that the most powerful response to being written off is demonstrating exactly how wrong those assumptions were. If this resonated with you, the real message is that people will reveal their true selves when you're vulnerable, and the ones who fail that test are showing you exactly who they are. Believe them, then prove them wrong by becoming more than they could imagine. Recovery isn't about returning to who you were before. It's about becoming someone new who carries those scars as proof of what you survived. And that's where I am now, teaching and researching and competing, carrying forward the perfect memory of everything I heard while they thought I couldn't understand. The worst thing someone told me after I recovered from a coma was actually said while I was still in it. And I remember every single word. If you're still here, you're a true fan. Show some support with a like and subscribe to catch the next one.